And the title of the book is taken from Orson Pratt,
Yeah.
from his speeches, right? And he labels both the act in relation to service and an act for the further relief of Indian slaves and prisoners. He labels both of them as slavery, right? So even in the 19th century, right, there's a debate that we highlight about these terms, and Orson Pratt is kind of represents the free labor ethic that's sweeping in across the nation, and the rest of the legislature sort of harkening back, like Chris said, to the various unfree labor categories that they grew up with.
It is time for another episode of the Cultural Hall, and there's three of us today. I'm excited to introduce my guest, Christopher Rich, and back to the Cultural Hall. Let's give it up for W. Paul Reeves. We are talking about this abominable slavery. That is a hard word for me to feel like I'm saying accurately, but I appreciate your guys' time being here in the Cultural Hall. Welcome.
Thank you
very much.
Now, Christopher, if people don't know who you are, besides being a strikingly handsome gentleman that is bald with a mustache, tell me your credentials. Where would people know, read, or have heard about you previously?
So currently I'm a PhD candidate in the University of Utah, with Paul Reeve is actually my chair for my committee. However, my first career was as an attorney, still am an attorney. I was in the U.S. Army JAG Corps active duty for 11 years. I'm still in the reserves. So in the past, my research has included questions about slavery in Utah, and I've written some articles about that question before. I also do a lot of legal history, and I write about national security law, going back to my original career.
Now, tell me, is the JAG system like what I would see on TV? Pretty accurate, sort of accurate, or not like what
I
you see on TV?
fly to my job in an F-14 almost every day.
So spot on. They got it. Hollywood got it exactly
And
right.
it's the only show that gets both the military and the law completely correct.
Uh, that certainly seems to be a little bit of a transition then with being a PhD candidate. Tell me why go from that to where you're going? What drove you as far as that goes?
Absolutely. I had always been interested in history. I've frankly been working with Paul on this book while I was still in the JAG Corps. It's been something that's been ongoing for the better part of a decade now.
Oh.
And ultimately, as much as I love the military, moving every 2 years sometimes becomes difficult on family.
Yeah.
And so I was looking for something else to do. And I decided that I was going to give it a chance and try history. And I'm very happy that I'm doing it.
Yeah. As Paul will tell you, huge money in history. People are clamoring, their hand over fist, just tossing money at historians. Please take it. Paul, welcome back to the Cultural Hall. Paul Reeve, tell me, when you're looking at this project, the book, by the way, that we'll talk about, second, third block of this discussion is called This Abominable Slavery. I still don't feel like I'm saying it right. I feel like I add too many syllables into that. It's from Oxford Press, talking about slavery in Utah. We'll get all into that, but I want to know, Paul, what was it about Christopher that you said, yeah, let's do this, partner?
Well, so a mutual friend of ours introduced us, Artist Partial, and he had written an article in the Utah Historical Quarterly on an act in relation to service, in which, he offered a legal analysis. So historians have certainly not neglected it, right? Neglected that law, but Chris brought a legal perspective that was missing. I didn't have the expertise on myself. And when I was working on Religion of a Different Color, I had asked him to look at the chapter that dealt with Brigham Young's speeches. Still trying to, I was trying to figure that out for Religion of a Different Color.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the questions that I asked of the church history library in relationship to my research on Religion of a Different Color that brought to light this folder in the George Watt collection from the 1852 territorial legislative session that had never been transcribed. And Chris had read that chapter in Religion of Different Colors, that I really think the speech that I was asking questions about is the 5th of February speech, not the 5th of January speech. I know I'm getting into the weeds really quickly.
Yeah.
He,
Dive in, everybody. Paul's going for it. Here we go.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Pull back a little bit. Chris is the one that said, "Hey, I think that was delivered on the 5th of February, which prompted, a new inquiry at the Church History Library, sort of brought to light these new speeches. And as all of this unfolded, said, hey, how about if we work on this together in terms of telling the story of the passage of these two, well, it ends up being 3 laws really that we focus on. And anyway, his legal expertise was what I think was missing from prior scholarship on what took place in 1852 in Utah Territory.
I like the idea that you put your arm around Chris, and when he gave you that feedback, you said, I think this is going to be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And then you guys started to talk about how the book would go. That's how it goes in my mind. There is a third name on the book, Legene Purcell Caruth. Tell me about that individual.
Yeah, so Legene is the Pittman shorthand expert at the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So the book would not exist without Legene. When my inquiry went to the Church History Department, it eventually found its way into Legene's hands, and she's the one that then said, so the query, what? 2 queries. Is there a Pittman version of Brigham Young's speech for January 5th, 1852 or February 5th, 1852? And the first response I received back was only, no, there's not a Pittman version of the January 5th speech. That's when I sent my draft chapter to Chris. He responded, hey, I think February 5th is really what you should ask. And so I sent a second query, and that made its way to Legene's desk. It asked only, is there a Pittman version of Brigham Young's 5th of February, 1852 speech?
Mm-hmm.
And for the Church History Library, right, you can't just do a fishing expedition, right? You have to have some sort of knowledge of what's going on. And, we'd sort of narrowed it down. And that question then prompted Legene. She looked in the George Watt collection. George Watt was the recorder for the territorial legislative session. And there was a folder in his collection of speeches from that legislative session that had sat there for 150 years, never been transcribed. His typical process would be to transcribe the shorthand version into longhand, and then that's how, speeches made it into publication, either in the Deseret News or the Journal of Discourses.
Mm-hmm.
He did not transcribe these speeches into longhand. So they sat in his collection, right, just in shorthand. And the Church History Department then asked or assigned, like she works full time for them, just transcribing these Pittman speeches. So they assigned her to transcribe those speeches into longhand. And, over the next couple of months, it was just sort of pins and needles almost every day. Will Legene send something new from the legislative session? And, just sort of amazing because it was bringing to light new context for the bills that were passed, but not only that, for the priesthood restrictions in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, anytime you have a burst of new evidence, right, like this is remarkable. No prior historians had access to these speeches. So, of course, Legene is a part of this because the book would not exist without her transcriptions. Chris and I did the writing in terms of the narrative history. Legene provided the evidence upon which the book is based.
It's worth noting for people who don't know, because I think there's enough of a generation that we say shorthand, longhand, that shorthand is essentially like, the way I would describe it is scribbles that make no sense to me on a piece of paper that there is definite meaning with each of it. My grandmother, who, passed a decade ago, she could do shorthand. She had been trained in that, but it's not like letters and characters, but it's just squiggly things that mean I guess it is characters, right, in that description of it, but to be translated and never before available to people, but thanks to Lejeune.
And
Yeah,
I,
that's
I
right.
always describe this as an Indiana Jones moment,
Oh,
where you go in, you find these ancient records in a secret language. And that was about the level of excitement that we were feeling pretty much every day. Once we discovered these and once Lejeune started transcribing them, just the knowledge that was coming out was absolutely incredible.
that is awesome. It's cool, and
And
it's cool. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
well, I was just going to say, to your point, there's a digital scan of one of the pages in the book manuscript so that readers can see for themselves what the Pitman looks like. And Lejeune literally is just one of a few people on the planet that continues to read Pitman. She will receive requests from outside of the Latter-day Saint context, like, hey, we found a Civil War diary recorded in Pitman shorthand. It's a 19th century version of shorthand that allows the recorder to capture almost verbatim, the words that are being said. And in the book, we include the fact that Wilford Woodruff is a legislator, and he recorded Brigham Young's 5th of February speech in longhand. And that's what prior scholars had mostly used, but he doesn't date it, right? So hence the confusion about the dates.
Mm-hmm.
And he managed to capture in longhand about 800 words of a 2,400 word speech from the Pitman shorthand. And so that's why we think the Pitman is so crucial, right? And it allows the recorder to capture almost verbatim what is being said. So, just a burst of new information as a result.
And I love that too, because I think that there's a certain perspective of us where it's like, well, we've got the internet, so everything that we have ever had is available now. But to know that, in the 21st century, there is continuing. And I think if we stop and think about it, we would probably go, no, of course there is new stuff. But I think a general attitude is like, we've got everything that we've got. Let's see what we could find or be able to use. Where there are, I'm sure, more of these things within the church, more of the things as a world in general, and worthwhile, as we'll talk about in the remainder of our discussion, as to why having this information that was not previously made available is so vitally important. I want to take this sort of general question, then we'll take a break and we'll come back and drill down on it a little bit. The title of the book is This Abominable Slavery. And for so many people, I think the idea of slavery in Utah in general is not something that they think of. That was East Coast, that was a different time, that was, other people, that was all of these things. I would, if you guys would each take just a moment and address when you have had the opportunity to talk about this project with general folks, not your scholarly friends and stuff like that, sort of the reception of like, hey, this is what it is, what their response has kind of been. And Chris, I'll let you roll first.
I think certainly there's surprise, both about the fact that slavery did exist in Utah, but also the complexity of the relationships. And that's one of the things we've really tried to discuss in this book, is the fact that most modern people have a view of labor or work, which includes only two things: free labor, where you go to a job and you're allowed to quit and you can be fired and that's the way it works, or slavery, and that there's just those two things. When in the mid-19th century, that wasn't the case. There were a series of nuances and gradations to work and to labor. And so you had this idea of servitude, which was something in between free labor and slavery. And so in speaking to most people, it's not simply explaining, yes, there was such a thing as slavery in Utah, but also it was a lot more complex than we think about it in the modern era. To try and describe these different types of service and servitude and so forth is very difficult for average people to wrap their heads around. And that says nothing about them. It's just outside of our experience.
Right.
Whereas for men like Brigham Young, men like Orson Pratt and so forth, they would have grown up where these forms of servitude were very normal. Brigham Young served as an apprentice. Many of the early Latter-day Saint leaders served in a kind of servitude. And that is how they viewed the world, and they found it completely normal.
Reception, Paul, as you've been talking to people about this particular project and this.
Yeah, so I teach Utah history, at the University of Utah, and I use some of these speeches. I assign the primary sources, to my students, and so, I encounter all kinds of people who are just simply unfamiliar with the fact that both indigenous as well as African American enslavement took place in Utah Territory. Uh, July 22nd, 1847, three enslaved men were a part of Orson Pratt's vanguard company into the Salt Lake Valley. They arrived 2 days ahead of Brigham Young. So Greenflake, Harkwells, and Oscar Smith are amongst the vanguard into the Salt Lake Valley 2 days ahead of Brigham Young. So enslaved people arrive in the valley in July 22nd, and then Native American enslavement has been taking place, for a couple of hundred years, in terms of the relationship between the Spanish and the Ute, and then 60 years that predate the arrival of the Latter-day Saints amongst the Western Ute, right? So both forms are, a part of the Latter-day Saint experience from the moment they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. And yeah, people are surprised by that. And as Christopher noted, right, we try to understand in this book what we think these laws that the legislature passed meant for those who passed those laws, but also we try to understand from the perspective of the people who those laws actually governed, right? The indigenous and African Americans. And so it's complex. It's a nuanced kind of take on things. And you have to recover the spectrum of unfree labor categories that existed in the 19th century for it to make sense.
Do you get any, either of you guys, maybe just quick anecdotally, anybody who's like, no, it didn't. That didn't happen.
Yes. Yes, all the time. But there's pushback from both perspectives. There's pushback from the idea that slavery existed at all, but there's also pushback from our argument about this more nuanced understanding and division between free labor, servitude, and slavery. Because there are some people who understandably see if there is any kind of situation in which a person exercises that level of authority, from their perspective, it must be slavery per se.
Mm-hmm.
And so to say, well, that's not what the legislature was trying to do, it strikes them as being overly apologetic, perhaps, and they want to push forward the narrative of this absolute dichotomy between free labor and slavery.
What about for you, Paul? As a professor, and what I hear about occurring in some classes, I can't help but wonder if you've been contacted by a parent who's like, I don't know why you're teaching my kid these false things, blah blah blah. Any sort of encounters of people just being like, no, we didn't.
Yeah, never from students an outright rejection, right? Surprise, definitely. And to address the skepticism, we have released, with the cooperation of the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, all of the speeches on a website hosted at the Marriott Library at the University of Utah, www.thisabominableslavery.org, so people can go and read them for themselves, right? So the evidence is there, and we're simply saying, like, look, this is the evidence. Here are the primary sources upon which our book is based. You can read it for yourselves. Yeah, definitely, some skepticism, but nonetheless, I think when you provide the evidence, people have to grapple with that, however they come to terms with it, right? And, to Chris's point, we also acknowledge, right, that for those for whom these laws were passed, right, they don't wake up the day after, the legislature passes an act in relation to service. We argue in the book, right, and say, oh, I've been legally defined as a servant, and my life is somehow so much better now than it was yesterday, right? However, the nuance of the argument is that they were granted some rights that they wouldn't have had before. And I know we can probably get into the details of all of that, but that's the complexity of the argument that we're making and what Utah passes, right? What did it mean for the legislators, but also what did it mean in the lives of those who these laws governed? And we try to address both questions. And we say, for those whom the laws governed, this is, they see this as slavery. And we use that language. We try to even use nuanced language to try to understand what this means. And the title of the book is taken from Orson Pratt. From his speeches, right? And he labels both the act in relation to service and an act for the further relief of Indian slaves and prisoners. He labels both of them as slavery, right? So even in the 19th century, right, there's a debate that we highlight about these terms, and Orson Pratt kind of represents the free labor ethic that's sweeping in across the nation, and the rest of the legislature sort of hearkening back, like Chris said, to the various unfree labor categories that they grew up with. So it's a lot to try to digest, right? And I think exposing people to the actual sources helps them to kind of work through it.
Agreed. Because otherwise it's your opinion and I can dismiss it. But if you can say, here, read what we are talking about from the original source, that is available for you. I think it's a profound work that you guys are doing and have done, certainly for this book, but also one that I think is so incredibly valuable. I want to take a quick break, and I want to come back and I want to talk about what we feel like the value is, what people can glean from it. We'll talk all about some of these different legislative speeches and sessions, and we're diving all the way in. Hold on tight, everybody. We'll come back in the second block of the Cultural Hall. BestDJinUtah.com is the website. That is where you go if you would like me to come and DJ your event. Now, will I do a family reunion where you all wear the same t-shirts? You bet I will. Will I travel to wherever you're at? Am I reasonable as far as what I cost? Yes. Do I bring a good time? Yeah, all the things. Listen, Best DJ in Utah, it's my company. It's a thing I do that allows me to be able to have the time to do the Cultural Hall. So if someone's getting married, you think, man, they need a great DJ. You're throwing a party, whether it's a 50th or 60th or 40th or 20th or whatever the party is. I've done them all and would love to be able to do that. An anniversary party, certainly done those. I did a baptism in 2023. Yeah, we did a big dance party at a baptism. Spoiler, not a Mormon baptism, but it was fun nonetheless. BestDJinUtah.com is a website. I will get back to you within 24 hours with a quote. Come on now. BestDJinUtah.com. Here in the second block of the Cultural Hall, remember you can become a Patreon saint of the Cultural Hall by going to patreon.com/the Cultural Hall, where for as little as $5 a month, you can become a Patreon saint. It gets you to have episodes before other folks. It also allows you to be a part of the secret but not sacred Facebook group, where we have all sorts of different conversations in the background about these episodes and about other things. I already know a topic of conversation will be the fine mustache that Christopher Rich has. People love to talk about the things that we see in the videos and stuff like that. So patreon.com/the Cultural Hall. So people will wonder, I think, the Cultural Hall certainly is everything about Mormonism, right? We talk anything that we can kind of bring around Mormonism. And it seems like in the first block, we talked about kind of the legislative, words are failing me right now, but we're talking about like the statehood of Utah. Is that essentially equivalent to the church's attitude, or is there some disparity that we would say, well, that's what the state of Utah was doing, but not necessarily the church? Are they one and the same, or are they different in this time period?
Well, certainly Brigham Young and then the members of the legislature are influenced by the theology that is developing around Mormonism as they are discussing these questions of race, slavery, etc. But it's not the full story. They're also dealing with a series of political disagreements in the nation at large. Brigham Young is looking at the fact that any position he takes on slavery might split the church. In the previous decades, three major religious denominations, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians, had all split over the question of slavery. So this is something that Brigham Young does not want to happen in his church. He wants statehood for Utah/Deseret. And so there's worry that any position that the Saints take in regard to slavery could affect their ability to enter the Union as a state. So there's no question that Brigham Young's interpretation, and Orson Pratt's interpretation for that matter, of Genesis, of the so-called curses of Cain, Canaan, etc., affect the way in which they try to deal with the problems of slavery and enslavement. Yet there are also these other political issues that they have to deal with at the same time.
I would just add, Brigham Young gives a speech on the 4th of February, 1852. Once again, another, new piece of information. And he's dealing with this question of, mixture of church and state. And he has no problem mixing church and state. So they're dealing with, they bring their theological understanding into their approach towards these laws that are being debated and passed. And he says he has every right to dictate matters of religious and political. And he's sort of, thumbing his nose at the nation as he does so. They're getting reports of runaway federal judges, right? And he is responding out of that context. You have federally appointed officials who have come to Utah Territory and then ultimately flee Utah Territory. They're the first runaways. The second runaways will lead into the Utah War. So there's that tension between the Latter-day Saints and the nation. And it's an all Latter-day Saint legislative session. Like every member of the legislature is a Latter-day Saint and a member, in religious positions, right? There are apostles, there are stake presidents, bishops, local leaders. It's a pretty committed group of Latter-day Saints who form this legislative body. And Brigham Young says, look, I can come in here and talk about matters religious and talk about matters political, and we have no problem in doing that. He defends even this notion that church and state can, be combined in territorial politics. So it's really hard to disentangle them. They're dealing with national political questions. Can human beings be held as property? Is the question that animates 1850s United States and ultimately leads the nation into war because the nation can't answer that question, right? And Utah Territory, they're trying to address that same question. And so they do bring their religious sensibilities to attempt to address that question, but they don't agree even on the answers that are being proposed. Hence the debate that we're talking about, and largely a debate between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young over some profound theological questions that have long-lasting ramifications for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that come out of a political debate over laws in Utah Territory.
And to amplify on that, there was no one Mormon position in regard to slavery. And that's what you see in these legislative debates is a broad range of perspectives. Now, by and large, Latter-day Saints generally and in the legislature did not support the institution of slavery. They did not like the idea that you could hold a human being as property. Yet there are a small number of Southern enslavers that did want slavery protected in Utah Territory. And then you have people on the other side of the spectrum, like Orson Pratt, who were basically abolitionists in their sentiments. And so one of the things that you see in the legislature and in other sources that we have is Brigham Young trying to referee between these various groups who are in the territory with their various policy preferences in regard to slavery.
It seems to me, though, as being such a hot button issue, and as you guys illustrate, that not wanting to take a stand because of a division within the church, but then it being very much at the time at hand. So was it just a you know what, let's agree to disagree, and we did the ultimate push off until the federal government decided to do something, or what was the narrative then for the territory? What was determined and what was decided, and how, and like timeline of those kind of things. What were we doing?
So from the time that the Latter-day Saints came to the Valley in 1847 until the end of 1851, the decision basically was, let's not do anything about this at all. There are a few instances where Brigham Young, other Latter-day Saint leaders are saying, look, we do not favor slavery, but we don't want to pass any laws in regard to that. And that was done on purpose. And it was done based on advice from a variety of individuals who had political connections in Washington, simply saying, you do not want a part of this. And it was not until the end of 1851 when it became very evident that Native American slavery was an ongoing issue, and that the Saints needed to address it in some way, that Brigham Young finally makes the determination that we need to create laws to define these unfree labor relationships between Native American children and Latter-day Saints, between African Americans and Latter-day Saints. And his argument to the legislature, he says quite clearly in January 5th, that slavery is wrong. Holding another person as property is legally and morally indefensible. However, servitude is something that is morally acceptable. He's not very clear about it. He probably thinks of servitude in terms of his own experience of apprenticeship, something very paternalistic, where you still have a master, you still have a servant, but where the individual involved is no longer property. So that's what he advises the legislature to do, is to create these forms of servitude. And it should be pointed out that this is for African American, enslaved African Americans, enslaved Native Americans, but also for European immigrants who are coming as part of the Perpetual Immigration Fund, or who are receiving money from private donors. They create forms of unfree labor for children in apprenticeship. They create forms of unfree labor for criminals and for debtors and for a lot of different people. And so basically, he's recreating the types of labor relationships which existed when he was growing up in New York State, which was a gradual emancipation state. Slavery was legal in New York until 1827, when Brigham was in his mid-20s. It had been gradually phased out over time. So that was the background that he was coming to these questions with. And that's ultimately what the legislature created, even though there were a lot of arguments along the way.
You know, the title of the book, This Abominable Slavery, just as I look at it, slavery, horrible, right? I can't believe the idea of it, the practice of it, and that's with the 21st century lens. Paul, does it make it different? Chris highlighted that it wasn't just African Americans. I think when people think of slaves, I think that's probably where mind instantly goes to. As we think about it a little bit more, we think about Native Americans being a part of that. But as it expands into immigrants and some of these other things, does that make it better or worse, or is it irrelevant in the argument about slavery?
Yeah, so it's once again a nuanced argument.
Sure.
So the speeches that we have now make it clear, like Chris said. So an act in relation to service is the law that is passed in 1852, designed to govern the relationship between white enslavers and their black enslaved. And some of those black enslaved are Latter-day Saints. They're baptized, right? Mm-hmm. So you have white Latter-day Saints enslaving their fellow co-religionists. Okay, that exists in Utah territory. What laws will govern that relationship? And it's important to understand what question animated politics in the 19th century. These are not 21st century questions. These are 19th century questions. And the question was, can human beings be held as property? And you have Northerners who say, no, that violates the fundamental foundation of this American nation, right?
Mhm.
And you have Southerners who say the Constitution protects property, and we can have human beings as property, and it's actually protected under the Constitution. And like I said, that question ultimately leads us into civil war because we can't solve it as a nation. And so that's the question that the legislature is attempting to address. And Brigham Young's answer is to that question, right? No, human beings can't be held as property. So what the legislature passes grants the enslaved African Americans in Utah Territory some rights. If you have some rights, you are not legally property, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And the same bill also addresses those who have arrived in Utah Territory with debts through the Perpetual Immigrating Fund, or they've received loans, right? And you have to pay those back. And prior scholars did not capture that aspect of the bill. And the debate makes it clear that they are talking about European immigrants. They mention them specifically by name, some who have arrived in debt to other Latter-day Saints. And the first couple of sections of the bill address that. And then the other sections of the bill address, African American enslavement in the territory. Granting enslaved people some rights elevates them in Brigham Young's mind, right, above the level of mere property. So the bill that passes does grant enslaved people some rights. Okay, but you can be brought to Utah Territory enslaved and die enslaved according to the law that passes, right? So once again, we're talking really, a complex argument here. I think it's important to understand what some of those rights are. So an enslaved person brought to the territory cannot be sold to another enslaver without the enslaved person's consent. If you have consent, you're not mere property.
Okay.
And that consent, the bill requires to be given to a probate judge outside the purview of the enslaver. You can't be taken from the territory without your consent. If you have consent, you're not mere property. Okay. It requires enslaved people to be educated. Chattel slavery laws in the South prevent enslaved people from being educated, right? So there are distinctions in terms of what Utah passes. They also drop from the bill language that would have passed on the condition of servitude to the next generation. And we believe that that is in response to Orson Pratt's strident anti-slavery speech. He wants the bill rejected in its entirety. He calls Africans innocent, right? And why would we bind innocent people, innocent Africans, right, to bondage? He says, and we have no authority from God to do so. God has not sanctioned this. There is no revelation in Pratt's mind, right? Like we are acting of our own accord and we should not do this in any sort of way. And the nuances of the bill that elevates the enslaved people above the condition of property is not satisfying to Pratt, right? He still labels it abominable slavery and wants it rejected, right? So those are the complicating factors playing out on the ground. The law that they passed, then they strike 18 important words from the bill that would have passed the condition of servitude on to the next generation. In essence, we make the argument, we think that means that the next generation wouldn't have been held enslaved. And that's another important distinction, right? Because they dropped the language that would have passed the condition on to the next generation. So yeah, it's complicated. You can be brought to Utah Territory as an enslaved person and die as an enslaved person under the law that's passed. Okay.
So let me ask this just to interrupt real quick. So then this law is passed. This is 1852, the legislative session of early 1852. So does it create the division? You say you have shared the sentiment certainly of Orson Pratt, where he's like, no, it's terrible. This shouldn't even be a part of it. Are there Prattites that are like, yes, absolutely. What are we doing? And there starts to be a rift or a division even between Brigham Young and Orson Pratt or the people? Or is this, we don't really like it, but just like 21st century saints in Utah go, well, but what are you going to do? It's the legislature, and we just sort of shrug. How does this impact the people here at that time?
Yeah, so I wish, Richie, that we had opinion polls, right? So historians are left with what evidence we have to go on, and people are not, writing in their journals. Are they even aware, right, of the laws that are being passed,
Hmm.
right? We have a sense that some enslavers are certainly aware because they respond to the legislation and will register some of their enslaved people. And so, how widespread is this even known? Remember that Pratt and Brigham Young's speeches are captured in Pitman shorthand, but not transcribed and not published,
Mm.
right? And so people in the 19th century don't know even what Pratt has said unless they're a part of the legislative body. We do have a sense by 1856, right, that there's, enslavers are not satisfied because this law takes away some of their rights, what they perceive as their rights to hold their enslaved people as property. It's been eroded, right? It's granted their enslaved people some rights, and they're not satisfied. And in 1856, when Utah applies the second time for statehood, one Southerner, Seth Blair, proposes that Constitution that is to be sent to Washington be explicitly a slave constitution.
Hmm.
And that produces another debate, and that proposal is soundly defeated, right? So it gives us a sense that, and Brigham Young actually complains, right? When enslavers arrive with their enslaved, the abolitionists are up in arms about it, right? So we only have those bits of evidence as to how the general population perceives slavery. And the sense is that the majority don't like it, right? The majority in the 1850 census are British-born, foreigners in Utah Territory. The majority of the population in Utah in 1850, according to the 1850 census, are British-born. And we have a couple of Latter-day Saints writing in British newspapers before they immigrate, expressing strong anti-slavery sentiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are the clues we have to go on in terms of what the general population is feeling. There's no kind of, hey, this law passed and then we're out picketing, right?
Right.
Because we don't like what the law has passed, and we have no sense that people are lining up behind Brigham Young or some Pratt, or that they're even aware at all, because these speeches were never published in the 19th century.
We do know of at least one case where a private citizen, he had been a member of the legislature, brings one of these cases to court. And what was happening is an enslaver named Williams Camp was trying to take his servant or slave, however we want to describe it, Daniel Camp, back to Texas. Daniel did not want to return to Texas, where he would have absolutely been in a state of slavery. And so he tries to escape. Williams Camp gets together an ad hoc slave patrol. They go and recapture him. And in the meantime, he complains to his bishop, Edwin D. Woolley, who had been a Quaker, became a Latter-day Saint. Most Quakers traditionally were very much anti-slavery. He was from Pennsylvania. And he complains before a judge that Williams Camp and his associates had kidnapped Daniel Camp in violation of territorial law, meaning an act in relation to service. So this goes before the judge to a preliminary hearing. Ultimately, the judge dismisses the case for lack of evidence, but he writes in his journal that he believes that the men were guilty.
Hmm.
Ultimately, Daniel Camp remains in Utah Territory. So that's an example of Edwin Woolley, who we infer was anti-slavery in his sentiments. He had been a part of the legislature. He understood how the law worked, and he used the law in order to defend Daniel Camp. And we argue that that's what the legislature had in mind, that in fact you could use an act in relation to service in order to protect African American servants to a certain degree. That doesn't change the fact that they were still in a form of servitude.
Mm-hmm.
But that was ultimately the goal.
And I would just add that Dan Camp is allowed to testify in his behalf in that preliminary hearing, something that you couldn't do as an enslaved person in the South where chattel slavery laws were in operation.
So, for someone just kind of coming into this interview and they said, "Oh, Richie's talking with Christopher and Paul. I wonder what this is about," and they're just sort of listening. Would you say, kind of on a very, 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 very high level, it's like it was messy in the mid 19th century, and here's a book about it? What is kind of the appeal to someone that's coming about it? Is it, you guys need to know that there was slavery, and here was the tricky ins and outs with the legislature. This was an overreach of power from such and such. Like, if you had to elevator pitch to a very just sort of lay person, what are we doing here?
Well, I would say it this way. Utah Territory is grappling with the question of human property in the 1850s, just like the rest of the nation. And our book helps to understand what Utah Territory's answer was to that question. And it's both African American enslavement and Native American enslavement. And that's true of New Mexico Territory. That's true of California. Mm-hmm. These are two political entities carved out of the Mexican cession as a result of the U.S. war with Mexico. And most scholarly attention has been paid to New Mexico and California. We are filling in the missing puzzle piece as to Utah's answer to this question that drives the nation into civil war.
Chris?
I agree with that. I think we tend to oversimplify this history. And it's because as Americans generally and Latter-day Saints, we tend to look for good guys and bad guys. Mm-hmm. People who are good and righteous and evil, wicked people. And we look for these same dichotomies and questions of slavery, and understandably, because we look back at enslavement now and we can say, yes, this was wrong. But we have to understand how complex this history really was. These were real people that were genuinely grappling with these questions, both political and moral. And you see these discussions that are taking place in the legislature, and they affected real people. They affected real African Americans. They affected real Native Americans. But the people in the legislature were not callous. They were not looking for domination, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. They were genuinely looking at these questions and saying, how do we solve this humanely? Yet they were doing it in a way that made sense to them. People who had been born in 1801, 1805. And the answers that they came up with are not particularly satisfying to us. And even for some people in the 19th century, they were not particularly satisfying. But it was something that they really were trying to come up with a good, humane answer.
And I would say not satisfying. I mean, we tried to understand it from the perspective of the enslaved African Americans and Native Americans, and that is really difficult to get at because of the lack of written sources from their own perspective, right? But certainly, if they're not free, whatever the legislature passes is not satisfying, right? It's a violation of what Thomas Jefferson describes as inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, so from their perspective in particular, right? You're granting me some rights. I'm still not free, right? And that doesn't come until 1862, not from Utah Territory, but from Congress, right? United States Congress, right, yep, outlaws slavery and involuntary servitude in all U.S. territories, and that includes Utah. So that would have been the legal end to enslavement in Utah Territory in 1862.
So you mentioned scholarship that's done about New Mexico and about California. Is this work that's coming about now in 2024? Where you guys can say, our piece, look, we've got this piece and we're putting it into the puzzle, and being able to see how California citizens and New Mexico citizens maybe did it different, and now this is just an added layer. You mentioned that there's new information that's coming out because it was able to be translated out of shorthand and all that. Is this a thing that other people have been like, we wonder how it's been like in Utah, or are you guys saying this is how it was in Utah, and people go, cool, great, thanks for putting this out?
So in the last few years, there's been a lot of historical work done on enslavement in the West,
Hmm.
both with African Americans and Native Americans. There's one author who refers to Native American slavery as the other slavery,
Mm.
for example. And there's been a number of great works dealing with New Mexico, dealing with California, how people there dealt with servitude. And they're looking at some of the same questions that we have in Utah Territory. Many of those works will mention Utah, but it's based on many of these older works who haven't had the access to these new sources that we have.
Hmm.
So the questions have been there, and people thought that they had a good answer to this, and based on the sources they had, scholars were doing the very best that they could. So this does fill in that puzzle. And one of the things that we try to do is compare how Utah responds to these questions with New Mexico, with California. So New Mexico, for example, creates an explicit slave code, even though there are something like 30, 40 enslaved people in New Mexico. And like in Utah, the legislature has ignored it for a long time.
Hmm.
Even in California, which was ostensibly a free state, you had a large number of enslaved people. Probably 400, some scholars estimate up to 2,000 enslaved people in California during the gold rush period. And that's not to mention the large number of Native Americans who were in some form of servitude. So this was something that was ongoing throughout the West as Euro-Americans are moving from the Eastern United States to the West. They're all having to grapple with these issues. As Paul had mentioned before, you have Native American slavery that's dating back hundreds of years.
Sure.
And then people bringing African American slaves at the same time. And so I do believe that this work will help round out those issues. And when you start viewing what the Utah legislature does in the context of the whole Mexican session, it brings a different perspective as to what's actually happening.
Paul, let me ask you this question. Are there things that we see that are done in the Utah Territory that are markedly different from anywhere else? And that's because of an influence of the LDS Church or of the gospel or doctrine within the church, or are we just kind of like everybody else in that time?
Well, the case that we make is that Utah, it's messy. So to answer your earlier question, it's messy, but they create an untidy center that holds. And, even in the West, right, especially as the nation is pulling apart, like the 1850s are it's a decade of growing sectionalism, right? The nation itself is straining north versus south to the point that we start killing each other and it costs us 600,000 lives,
Hmm.
right? That's the dire nature of these questions. And we argue that Utah Territory creates an untidy center that holds. Arizona is created out of New Mexico from the fact that some Southern secessionists wants a slave territory. You have Southerners who are influential in the California legislature, and there are efforts at carving off Southern California and explicitly legalizing slavery. But they're not successful on that, but they do create loopholes that allow for enslaved people to continue to exist there. There are enslaved people that get their freedom in California as well. So it's complicated and messy throughout the West. The one distinction that I would make about the Utah session is that religion is very much explicit in the legislative session. And so, these laws passed to govern Native American and African American enslavement in the territory also have theological ramifications. And Brigham Young will first publicly articulate a race-based priesthood restriction in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in this legislative session. And that is not taking place, anywhere else.
Sure.
So the mix of religion and politics in this legislative session, I think, is really unique. We talked about some of the distinct aspects of the bill that Utah passes. different from California, different from New Mexico. So there are some unique things. We haven't really talked about the Native American bill much, but that grants 20-year indentures,
Mm-hmm.
and it uses the language of apprenticeship. And so I think that's also influenced by Latter-day Saint theology. But you have distinctions playing out in New Mexico and California as well, right? Latter-day Saint theology sees Native Americans as fallen descendants of ancient Israel in need of redemption. And so we're not, you can't keep a Native American in unfree labor
Sure.
for life like you could an African American, according to the laws that are passed in this legislative session. It's up to 20-year indenture using the language of apprenticeship. They're supposed to come out of the indenture with marketable skills that, in theory, would allow them to integrate into society. In practice, something different that we try to grapple with as well. I would just add, for Orson Pratt, neither is satisfying, right? He describes both as slavery and says, no to both.
Picking up something that you said, the idea of kind of race in the priesthood, to simplify it that way, that had never been publicly shared from Brigham Young until that session?
That's correct. So it's in operation before then.
Mm-hmm.
So we have evidence, right, that it's been discussed at least as early as 1849, that there's a transition in Brigham Young's thinking from 1847 to 1852, and people are aware, maybe a limited number of people. There's a meeting that takes place in 1849 where they are talking about racial priesthood restriction, but it's the first public articulation from a prophet president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it comes in this legislative session. Brigham Young gives a speech on the 23rd of January where he first publicly articulates it, and then really his most strident speech is the 5th of February speech, where he defines people of Black African descent as cursed descendants of Cain. An argument that Orson Pratt does not buy. And Orson Pratt will say, we have no proof that Africans are descendants of Cain, right? So those two men do not agree. It's the only rationale Brigham Young ever gives for the racial priesthood restriction, and Orson Pratt rejects it.
Yes.
And Brigham Young has taken a concept which is millennia old by this point and puts a unique theological spin on it. So the so-called curse of Cain, curse of Canaan from Genesis, Christians, Jews, and Muslims for 1,000 years had used those alleged curses as a justification for chattel slavery for African Americans. Brigham Young doesn't buy that. He doesn't believe that these curses authorize chattel slavery, but he reinterprets it to be about hierarchy. And so that becomes the basis in his mind for, on the one hand, a priesthood ban, on the other hand, a denial of the right of African Americans to vote or to participate in territorial politics.
Oh, go ahead, Paul. Did you want to say something?
Well, I mean, since Chris brought it up, another unique thing about this legislative session is the fact that Orson Pratt has proposed that Black men be allowed to vote in 1852. So the election bill we also deal with in this book manuscript, and it's in relationship to the fact that Orson Pratt is advocating for Black male voting rights. And that brings Brigham Young's really strident response. We just as well give mules the right to vote as Negroes and Indians, Brigham Young will say. And it's his most racist kind of response to Orson Pratt's proposal that Black men be allowed to vote.
I want to take a break. When we come back in the third block, I want to ask you guys the 3 questions that we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall. So I'll ask those of you, plus a couple other follow-up things as we talk about this Abominable Slavery. Link for it, by the way, in the show notes if you would like to purchase the book. And please do. These guys have done just tremendous work, and we're not going to be able to cover it all, but very sliver in the time that we've got. So encourage you to check out that work that they've done. We'll come back in the third block.
Imagine running a small business today. It's challenging. Imaging and internet presence is an absolute must. Even with that, you're still a small star in a bright cyber universe. Now, imagine you have someone who understands how to get your site designed for your talents and then easily searched by potential clients. Imagine Lennon Design. Whether it's strictly a website or a whole package of logo creation, advertising media, and promotional materials, Lennon Design is your partner in business. They'll test the boundaries of their imagination to create something unique for you. When you need creative, affordable design, let it be Lennon Design. Call 801-699-3022 or visit lennondesign.com.
Here in the third block of the Cultural Hall, remember, email address is contact@theculturalhall.com. You can always email and say, wow, what a conversation. I'm going to have to listen to that a few times. There were things that I didn't catch the first go round with Chris and Paul and you, Richie, or you can be like, man, that was amazing. I love it. Favorite episode of the Cultural Hall ever, or something not at all related with this episode at all. Contact@theculturalhall.com. That is the email address. One of the things that strikes me about this work is at any moment, because you guys mentioned these, these translations that are made available, like at any moment, there could be a whole other part of this that we're just completely unaware of the history of this, right? There could be another added piece, an added speech, something that was found in a folder in the back part of the whatever that continues to do that. Is that exciting to you guys? Or is it intimidating to know that in 10 years with a couple of documents, this may be completely irrelevant, what you've spent so much time on?
I think it's exciting. I really, Paul and I and Legine over the last 10 years have, I think, brought together the best interpretation of the evidence that we could with these new documents, with things which existed before. But it's fun as a historian to think that there might be something else out there. At this point, I doubt that it would change very much the interpretation that we've given to the facts so far. It's possible that there's something out there that would say something completely different. But I, for one, welcome new information. And if people want to disagree, for example, with our interpretation, great, show us the evidence. And I want to keep myself open to that.
So one of the things in the book we talk about, that you guys talk about, is Utah's Juneteenth, which I think is a fantastic, as we look at Juneteenth and kind of that collaboration or that bringing it into the 21st century, like, this is what this is, Juneteenth, the end of slavery. I would like to go there within the book and within your guys's kind of conclusion, if you will. What do we come away from? Besides we know a couple people didn't agree, it was messy, and we sort of know the end result. Where do you guys come down on this?
So, in one of the chapters, we attempt to address, like, how does this play out in the lives of enslaved peoples, both African American and Native American. We use the example of Tom, who is brought to Utah Territory in the fall of 1852. So the bill has been passed, right? And he dies in 1862, a few months before the United States Congress did in fact outlaw slavery in all U.S. territories. And that's June of 1862. And so, we find no evidence of any of the ways that the law that Utah passed would have impacted his life. And he was reliant upon the United States Congress, not his co-religionists, not his enslavers. He's baptized in Utah Territory after he arrives, right, as an enslaved person. And his bishop becomes his enslaver. He's
okay.
So then he's reliant upon United States Congress, right, to free him, even though he dies a few months before that would have happened. And so, he dies as an enslaved man in Utah Territory, reliant upon Republicans in Congress. Remember, the founding platform for the Republican Party, the Republicans said, we have the right and imperative duty to prohibit in the territories the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. That's their 56 founding platform for the Republican Party. And actually politicians keep their promises, right? Like, when does that ever happen? And when Republicans win control of Congress in 1862, they keep that pledge. They pass a law prohibiting polygamy in the territories, the Moral Anti-Polygamy Bill, and a law prohibiting slavery in the territories, not in the states, right? We're not talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. We're not talking about the 13th Amendment. We're talking about a law that will criminalize slavery and unfree labor, or excuse me, what am I looking for, Chris?
Involuntary servitude.
Involuntary servitude, sorry, in all U.S. territories, right? And so that would bring the legal end to enslavement in Utah Territory if anyone knew about it, right? The Deseret News does publish notice of this law that's passed. It's on page 4, buried in the middle of a column. Do white enslavers become aware that slavery has been, declared unlawful in all U.S. territories? Are enslaved people aware? Do they have to wait until the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment? We don't know. And I'll let Chris address some of the evidence that we dealt with in terms of trying to figure out the answer to that question. But, it's Utah's Juneteenth is ostensibly legally when Congress passes that law and Abraham Lincoln signs it into law in June of 1862. In practice, the question is ambiguous. We don't know when enslavers and their enslaved learn of the law and are in fact then freed.
And as Paul was saying, it's simply not clear what happens. So we do know that people in Utah Territory, at least leaders, were aware of the fact that Congress passed that law. But the problem, as we've mentioned all along, is the ambiguity of these laws in regard to servitude and slavery. There is a good argument that an act in relation to service could have still been operative even after Congress passed this law. One could argue that, as Brigham Young and many others did, that it did not authorize slavery. And one could even argue that it did not authorize involuntary servitude. There were enough provisions in it which were supposed to provide enslaved people with the ability to consent, that one could argue that this wasn't involuntary, that people knowingly consented to these kind of service relationships. We do know that by 1866, the law is no longer on the books, but we don't have any evidence of how it was rescinded. We don't have any debates or arguments or anything else. So we don't know if it was directly as a result of this congressional statute in 1862, or as a result of the end of the Civil War, or as a result of the 13th Amendment. We just don't know for sure. We do know that the Indian indenture law continued in effect for at least another 10 years.
Jeez.
And that this was something, because yet again, the idea was that this was some form of apprenticeship. And many of the legislators had argued that we put our own children, our own white children, in similar circumstances. So why should it be different from Native Americans whom we are rescuing from what they believed was the possibility of torture and death in other circumstances? And so, as Paul was mentioning, it's just not clear what actually happens here.
Wow, that's got to be both super fascinating and fun to kind of marvel and wonder about, like, what was it? And then also maybe a little bit frustrating to be like, where's the document? 1862 to 1866. Why did we not keep records? Legene, look through the folders. Did you look at the back of the folder? Is there something else there? Why? What? Because there seemingly would have been something that sort of drove that that way. Interesting. The subject matter, I love that we have said multiple times that it is different arguments being made, that it is messy, that it is ambiguous, that it is all of these things. One of the things that you mentioned early on, and I want to make sure that people know, that online resource, there will be a link for the Abominable Slavery on the show notes, so people can see some of the research, that firsthand documentation that you guys have done, interactive and super easy to be able to read, understand, and then also to be able to see, as I'm looking at it, even right now, you can see the original documents in it, and then obviously the sources. So if you've been listening to this and you guys are like, wrong, they're wrong, you can take them bit by bit with their argument and be able to have that discussion with them. So exciting. I love being able to speak with you guys about this. It's just a tremendous amount of work, I recognize, when you talk about a decade's worth of time to be discussing something that some people don't even know existed at all. Slavery, Utah? Nope, never. And it's like, okay, well, not only yes, but there's a rich history of debates between church leaders and all of these things. I just, I can't thank you guys enough for the work that you guys do, both in entertaining me as well as, the scholarship that helps bring these things to light, help us to have a greater understanding of the history of Utah, the history within the church, and then with slavery as well. So a huge kudos to the two of you. Perhaps because of time, I think I may just ask you guys one of the three questions that we ask everyone who steps into the cultural hall. Just know that that's for time purposes. Don't feel slighted at all. The question that I would ask each of you, and ask you to interpret it however you may, but the question remains, is what is your favorite part of your faith? And I will let whichever of you ask or answer that question first. And again, up for interpretation however you would like.
The favorite part of my faith is the sense that we can receive inspiration. There have been parts in this process where absolutely I have felt like I should look at particular areas in the church archives, for example, and just all of a sudden amazing things come out of it. And so I like the fact that we can have that ongoing communication with the Lord, and that we can be inspired.
Yeah. I love that, because it seems to me like there's all of these people, and I'm putting words, but let me put the words around this, that there are people that are on the other side that are like, Christopher, share our story, share these words, this history needs to be known. And from the other side of the veil, at least according to my beliefs, people can cheer us on and be able to help guide and inspire and direct us towards those things. And I think that's awesome. I know you didn't say it, but I will say that I just think that that's incredible. Paul, what about you?
Oh man. When I teach my Mormonism class, we sort of walk through the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is at once hierarchical and democratic. That as it plays out on the ground level, right? There is this ability to kind of make sense of it for ourselves in the pews. And sometimes that percolates up, right? For me, the favorite part of the faith is trying to understand it from the perspective of those in the pews. And I guess if I get personal about my own faith, it's the grace of Jesus Christ that is meaningful to me. The Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the New Testament all say that Christ's grace is sufficient for me. And I rely upon that every day, because I'm on a stumbling walk with God, and I have to rely upon his grace. Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate your time. Again, link to purchase the book in the show notes. Also a link to the online, are we calling it a digital exhibition? What are we, an interactive online, whatever. It's all sorts of great resources that people can click through, study more. And I find your guys' scholarship just fascinating, and I hope that people will take advantage of this jewel that has been made available, whether they purchase it or just interact with it online or able to get after it. I hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you're not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you will be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, Chris at Alpine Lakes Travel, Rick McGee, Debbie Wanless, Chocolate Cake Bites Podcast, and the Tiger with a U will be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.
Save me a seat, it's sure to be neat on the back row. We read